Hi, this is Eddie Van Halen. Alex was playing my drums, and he got better than me. Immediately, we said, okay. And then it was a fight over who got to play drums. So I said, take my damn drums, I'll play your guitar.
Some deaths feel inevitable, and some haunt us forever. The death of Eddie Van Halen belongs to the latter. He was the immortal icon of the electric guitar, the man who invented a language of sound no one had ever heard, no one had ever imagined. Yet this same man, the quiet genius behind the Frankenstrat, gradually faded away in solitude, addiction, illness, and a loneliness no spotlight could ever dispel. When Eddie passed away at 65, millions mourned a rock legend. But perhaps only one person truly grasped the depth of that loss: Wolfgang Van Halen, his son, his final bandmate, and the silent witness to his father's battle with time, with a body slowly decaying and with wounds that were never given a name. Eddie Van Halen didn't die from an accident or a scandal or a reckless act. He died from a series of choices, and from the things he had no choice over. He died believing that metal from his guitar picks caused more cancer than cigarettes. He died because he once postponed hip surgery to go on tour. He died in a world where every mistake was magnified, but every pain had to be hidden backstage. So what turned a poor mixed-race child into the man who redefined modern guitar? What drove him into quiet wars with alcohol, with his bandmates, and with himself? And why did his son, after everything, refuse to play a single Van Halen song, even in tribute? The journey of Eddie Van Halen is not just the story of an artist. It's the tragedy of a genius, and a melody fading in a world too loud to listen. Early life. Eddie Van Halen was born on January 26, 1955, in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, with the birth name Edward Lodewijk Van Halen, a name with classical undertones inspired by composer Ludwig van Beethoven. His father, Jan Van Halen, was a professional saxophonist and clarinetist from the Netherlands. His mother, Eugenia van Beers, was Indonesian, a strong, resilient woman who had left behind an unstable homeland to build a new life in Europe. But in post-war Holland, a mixed-race family was not always welcome. Jan and Eugenia faced silent but persistent discrimination, constantly feeling like outsiders in a place they once called home. With two young sons, Alex, born 1953, and Eddie, they made a decisive choice: to leave Europe. In 1962, the Van Halen family boarded a ship crossing the Atlantic, carrying with them the American dream and just $50. During the 9-day voyage, Jan played in the ship's band to pay for the family's fare. It was the beginning of a new life, harsh, uncertain, but filled with hope, in Pasadena, California. However, America did not greet them with open arms. The Van Halens crowded into a rented house shared with two other families. The four of them slept on one bed, sharing a bathroom, a kitchen, and the lowest rung of the immigrant social ladder. Eddie and Alex spoke no English and instantly became targets of bullying in schools that, in the early 60s, still practiced racial segregation. As mixed-race kids who spoke broken English and dressed differently, they were seen as other. Eddie would later recall, "It was so bad I can't even describe it. We were called foreigners. We got beaten up, isolated. And because we couldn't speak the language, we couldn't fight back." Music became the only place where the brothers could feel normal. Their parents made them study classical piano from a very young age, hoping they'd become serious musicians. Eddie practiced for hours every day, not out of passion, but because there was nowhere else to hide. Until one thing changed everything: the Beatles. George Harrison's guitar, those bright, liberating pop-rock chords, lit a fire in Eddie's mind. For the first time, music wasn't just pressure, it was freedom. Eddie dropped piano and switched to drums. Alex picked up the guitar. But after a while, Eddie realized Alex was the better drummer. When Alex gave the guitar another try, he showed natural talent. So, they switched, completely by chance. Eddie picked up the guitar and never let go. From that moment on, the little Asian immigrant boy carried the guitar like an extension of his body. He walked around the house with it, obsessively repeating riffs and chords, playing until his fingers bled. There were no teachers, no books, just instinct, determination, and the spiritual hunger of someone who had never found a place in this world. But even within music, darkness crept in. At the age of 12, Eddie's father gave him alcohol to calm his nerves before his first performance. Jan Van Halen, himself an alcoholic, believed that was how a man conquered stage fright. Eddie believed him. That was his first sip, and also the beginning of a silent tragedy that would last a lifetime. But at that moment, Eddie didn't know. He only knew one thing. With a guitar in his hands, the world fell silent. No more bullying, no more racism, no more loneliness. And music, for him, became the only religion worth believing in. Successful career. When Van Halen released their debut album in 1978, it was as if all the rules of rock had been turned upside down. No one had ever heard a guitar sound like that. A nearly 2-minute solo, Eruption, exploded like lightning on a clear day, redefining every standard of technique, creativity, and emotion. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a great guitarist. He was a phenomenon, an inventor, a revolutionary of sound. The debut album sold over 10 million copies, becoming one of the most successful debut records in rock history. But more importantly, Van Halen gave the electric guitar a completely new image. The Frankenstrat, Eddie's self-built guitar, a mashup of a Stratocaster body with a Gibson pickup, hand-painted and held together with tape, wasn't just an instrument. It was a symbol of his philosophy, creative freedom without limits. From that moment on, Van Halen became a dominant force in the 1980s, releasing a string of hit albums: Van Halen 2, 1979, Women and Children First, 1980, Fair Warning, 1981, and Diver Down, 1982. Throughout these years, Eddie increasingly emerged as the band's creative core, composing, arranging, and constantly pushing the boundaries of guitar technique. But behind the scenes, tension was quietly building. Lead singer David Lee Roth was the band's flamboyant showman, flashy, confident, attention-seeking. Eddie, by contrast, was introverted, meticulous, emotionally sensitive, and disliked being controlled. Roth wanted the band to be about spectacle and entertainment, while Eddie craved musical depth and creative experimentation. The conflict peaked after Diver Down, when Roth insisted on including 5 cover songs, a move Eddie strongly opposed. Determined to never repeat that mistake, Eddie built his own studio, 5150 Studios, at home, so he could work independently and maintain full control over the band's music. The result was 1984, the legendary album featuring the hit Jump, whose synth-heavy sound sparked controversy. It was the first time a keyboard, not a guitar, took the lead. And it was a massive success. Jump hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the album sold over 10 million copies. But that very success would ultimately tear the band apart. David Lee Roth left the group in 1985 after years of growing creative conflict and unresolved tension. Van Halen stood at a crossroads. Then Eddie made a surprising call to Sammy Hagar, a seasoned solo artist with a very different style from Roth. More soulful, more mature, and more focused on music than image. The Hagar era began, and it was just as successful, though in a different way. 5150, 1986, named after Eddie's studio, exceeded all expectations, debuting at #1 on the Billboard charts. It was the band's first time topping the charts, launching a second golden era. Over the next decade, the new lineup, Eddie, Alex, Michael, and Sammy, released 3 consecutive #1 albums: OU 812, 1988, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, 1991, Balance, 1995. Their music became more mature, their lyrics more personal, and Hagar's voice added a deeper emotional tone. At this point, Eddie wasn't just the guitarist. He was the band's musical brain, composing, arranging, producing, and fine-tuning every technical detail. But success didn't prevent conflict. Inside the band, Eddie and Alex became increasingly withdrawn, controlling, and difficult to reach. Partly due to alcohol dependency, partly from a growing obsession with perfection. Sammy Hagar, independent and outspoken, began clashing with the Van Halen brothers. Tensions exploded in 1996 when the record label pushed for a greatest hits album, Best of, Volume 1. Hagar disagreed with the way it was curated and marketed. Eddie, frustrated with Hagar's star attitude, lost patience. The result, Hagar left the band, and Van Halen once again lost its frontman. In a panic, the band attempted a reunion with David Lee Roth, even appearing together at the 1996 MTV Video Music Awards. But just hours backstage, everything fell apart as old wounds reopened. Roth accused Eddie of insulting him. Eddie was exhausted by Roth's unchanged ego. The reunion collapsed after a single taping session. With neither Roth nor Hagar, Van Halen turned to a new lead singer, Gary Cherone, formerly of Extreme. In 1998, they released Van Halen 3, the only album featuring Cherone, but its commercial and critical failure led the band to go on hiatus. From legends, Van Halen had slipped into an identity crisis. Though still creatively driven, Eddie began to struggle with health issues, alcohol addiction, and the crushing pressure of protecting the band's legacy. He nearly vanished from the public eye in the early 2000s, marking a long pause in the symphony that had once shaken the world. And like many genius artists, the brighter they burn, the more they risk being consumed from within. For Eddie, the height of his career also marked the beginning of his most brutal internal battles, inner struggles and scandals. Eddie Van Halen was the guitar hero for millions, but behind the spotlight was a soul in constant turmoil. He battled fear, loneliness, addiction, control issues, and sometimes his own genius. Even at the height of his success, Eddie was known for his obsessive control in the studio. He would tweak drum parts, redo bass lines, and even re-record other band members' sections if they didn't meet his standards. To Eddie, music wasn't a group effort. It was a personal vision worth sacrificing everything for. This led some to label him authoritarian, with former members accusing him of being disrespectful. But beneath it all was likely a deeper fear, the fear of not being heard. Though he was the musical heart of Van Halen, Eddie was often overshadowed by larger-than-life personalities like David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar, men who dominated the media with their words and images, while Eddie just wanted to let his guitar speak. As a result, he withdrew, preferring the isolation of his studio to the noise of crowds and press. That isolation became dangerous when paired with alcohol and cigarettes, companions that followed Eddie for decades. He began smoking at 12, drinking at 13, and by the post-balance era, he was spiraling into severe addiction. Journalists began noticing the changes: his thin frame, erratic speech, absences from press events. Rumors spread that he was struggling with depression and paranoia, convinced he was being betrayed by the very band he created. In 2000, Eddie was diagnosed with tongue cancer, a fact he kept secret for months before the press found out. Instead of resting, he continued recording, kept smoking, and insisted that his cancer wasn't caused by cigarettes, but by the metal picks he held in his mouth while playing. The statement sparked backlash, with many accusing him of refusing to take responsibility for his own body. Around the same time, his personal life crumbled. His marriage to actress Valerie Bertinelli, once seen as a rock and roll fairy tale, ended after more than 20 years, largely due to Eddie's instability and addiction. Valerie later revealed that Eddie became uncontrollable at times, breaking things, no longer the man she once loved. Their son Wolfgang, she said, was the only reason they managed to stay civil through the divorce. One of the most shocking rumors about Eddie was that he once brought a gun to a recording studio to threaten members of Limp Bizkit after a failed collaboration. According to industry friends, Eddie, feeling abandoned mid-jam session, drove to the band's headquarters with an AR-15 in a drunken rage. Though never confirmed, the story spread widely, reinforcing the image of Eddie as a volatile genius, prone to explosions and hard to manage. Even in his final years, though he had beaten mouth cancer, Eddie was diagnosed with throat cancer, then lung cancer, and finally, metastasis to his brain and neck. Some say he was being consumed not only by disease, but by his own past, a past that refused to admit weakness. Perhaps Eddie's deepest wound was never learning how to forgive himself. He played guitar as if every note was an apology to those who had left, to his younger self, to his son who had watched him fall. Few artists have ever embodied such contradiction, living legend on the outside, fractured soul within, and that very conflict made Eddie both heartbreaking and irreplaceable. On the outside, he was the king of the guitar. On the inside, he was still a shy Dutch immigrant kid, speaking broken English, always afraid of being left behind. An artist who gave up everything just to be heard, but in the end, chose silence. Personal life. Behind Eddie Van Halen's thunderous guitar was a quiet, vulnerable, and deeply conflicted man. While the world saw him as a guitar god, in his private life, Eddie often stepped back, lived reclusively, and avoided the spotlight whenever possible. The most talked about relationship in Eddie's life was with actress Valerie Bertinelli, a beloved American TV star known for her wholesome image. They met in 1980 when Eddie was already a rising rock star, and Valerie was just 20 years old. The couple quickly became tabloid favorites, a golden couple of Hollywood and rock. But behind the glamour was a relationship marked by turbulence. Eddie and Valerie married in 1981. In the early years, they tried to maintain a normal family life, despite the pressures of fame and relentless touring. In 1991, they welcomed their only child, Wolfgang Van Halen, who would later become a musician himself and join Van Halen during their reunion era. However, their marriage gradually unraveled. Valerie once shared that Eddie was incredibly sweet and gentle, but also prone to losing control. His dependence on alcohol, cigarettes, and erratic lifestyle strained their relationship. "There were times I didn't recognize him," Valerie said in a later interview. "He was destroying himself and dragging down everyone around him." Despite efforts to stay together for the sake of their son, they officially separated in 2001 and divorced in 2007. Valerie explained, "We didn't break up because we stopped loving each other. We broke up because we couldn't survive together." Eddie had a few brief relationships during their separation, but in 2009, he married again, this time to Janie Lisewski, a public relations professional who had worked with the band. Janie was nearly 2 decades younger, but her maturity and healthy lifestyle helped Eddie regain a sense of peace in his final years. They held a modest wedding at their home in Studio City, with Wolfgang as best man and Valerie also attending, a rare sign of the post-divorce harmony they had built. Eddie was never the type to flaunt his family. He rarely spoke publicly about his son, but he carried a quiet, unwavering pride in Wolfgang's musical abilities. In 2006, when the band invited 15-year-old Wolfgang to replace bassist Michael Anthony, many were skeptical. But for Eddie, it wasn't about pushing his son into the spotlight. It was a chance to truly connect after years of separation caused by career demands and personal turmoil. In his final years, Eddie spent most of his time at home in Los Angeles, focused on cancer treatment and recording unfinished music. He also maintained a peaceful relationship with Valerie and the family. The three of them, Eddie, Janie, and Valerie, were often seen together supporting Wolfgang at major events, especially during his performances. Eddie's personal life wasn't loud, nor was it filled with tabloid scandals, but it was rich with quiet contradictions and unspoken sadness. It was the life of a genius artist, always seeking perfection in music, but not always finding peace in love and family. And if anything made Eddie truly happy outside of his guitar, it was being a father. Wolfgang once said, "I didn't just lose a dad, I lost my best friend." A simple sentence, yet enough to understand. In Eddie Van Halen's turbulent world, family may not have always been something he could hold on to, but it was the one thing he never let go of. Final years and legacy. The final years of Eddie Van Halen's life were no longer filled with blazing lights, sold-out tours, or chart-topping hits. But in many ways, they were the years in which he lived most authentically, in a modest home in Los Angeles, alongside his second wife Janie and his son Wolfgang, who had become the greatest pride of his life. Eddie was first diagnosed with tongue cancer in 2000. Although part of his tongue was removed and he was declared cancer-free in 2002, the shadow of the disease never truly left. Throughout the next decade, he faced a series of severe health issues, a hip replacement, addiction treatment, and recurring symptoms. By 2019, the cancer had metastasized to his neck and brain, forcing Eddie to quietly abandon all plans for a final reunion tour. One Wolfgang had envisioned as a farewell celebration featuring Roth, Hagar, Michael Anthony, and even Gary Sharon. But Eddie never made it. On October 6, 2020, he passed away at St. John's Medical Center in Santa Monica after a long battle with cancer. In the room were only Janie, Valerie, and Wolfgang, the three people who mattered most in his life, witnessing a legend take his final breath. Eddie's death shook the music world. Guitars were hung upside down, tapping solos echoed across stages big and small. Artists from Joe Satriani to Slash, Tom Morello, Steve Vai, Lenny Kravitz, and even Brian May paid tribute to the man who had redefined the electric guitar. No one ever played like Eddie, and no one ever will. Eddie Van Halen's legacy isn't just found in the 75 million records sold, or the 11 studio albums Van Halen released, including 4 that hit #1, one on the Billboard 200. It lives in the Frankenstrat, the iconic DIY guitar Eddie assembled from spare parts, creating a sound the world had never heard. It lives in the two-handed tapping technique that he didn't invent, but transformed into the defining voice of an entire generation. Eddie once said, "I don't think I'm the best, I just think I'm different." And he was right. That difference inspired millions to pick up the guitar, compelled hundreds of great musicians to admit his influence, and forced producers to rethink how guitars should be recorded after hearing Eruption. Eddie Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix are often cited as the two most revolutionary electric guitarists of the 20th century. If Hendrix turned the guitar into the scream of a rebellious soul, Eddie transformed it into a high-performance machine, where every finger could create an entire universe of sound. From two-handed tapping and controlled feedback to crafting the legendary Frankenstrat, Eddie didn't just play the guitar, he reinvented the instrument itself. He famously performed the solo on Michael Jackson's Beat It, a landmark moment that bridged rock and pop, blurred genre boundaries, and elevated the guitar in mainstream music like never before. In 2007, Van Halen was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a milestone honoring not just their commercial success, but their profound cultural impact. Artists like Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Slash, Dimebag Darrell, and more have all said they wouldn't be who they are without Eddie. But Eddie's most important legacy wasn't left on stage. It was embodied in his only son, Wolfgang Van Halen. Though carrying the Van Halen name and playing bass during the band's final years, Wolfgang chose not to use his father's music to launch his own career. Instead, he formed the project Mammoth WVH, a tribute to Van Halen's original band name and a declaration of independence. Wolfgang said, "I'll never replace my father. No one can. And I don't want to try." In a world where legends are often imitated, Eddie Van Halen was unreplicable. He was an icon, a revolutionary, the living definition of a musical genius, not just for what he created, but for how he created it. Alone, quietly, relentlessly, without magic. Just a guitar, an amp, and a burning soul. Eddie Van Halen didn't just leave behind music. He left behind a void, one no solo could ever fill. Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a guitar virtuoso. He was an earthquake that shook the entire world of rock music. He didn't need a PR campaign or scandals to grab attention. The sound he created, wild, technical, and full of emotion, was enough to make an entire generation stop and listen. Every solo he played was like a flame, burning through technical limits and leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of those who heard it. He lived in contradiction, a quiet, reserved man who always smiled in public, yet wrestled with loneliness, illness, and personal pain. Eddie wasn't a legend because he was perfect. On the contrary, it was his imperfections, the times he fell and got back up, that made him immortal. From blazing concert stages to the silence of the studio, from topping the Billboard charts to battling cancer, from the roar of Eruption to the sighs of unfinished melodies, Eddie Van Halen's journey is living proof that a great artist isn't defined solely by success, but by their ability to create what no one else even dared to dream. And when that guitar fell silent on a day in October 2020, the world didn't just lose a musician. We lost a piece of the soul of rock and roll. So what do you think about Eddie Van Halen's legacy? Is there anyone brave enough and talented enough to carry on what he left behind? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the lives of legends who can never be replaced.